All right, in this video, I want to talk about some of the political implications of the ideology of race realism. This is one of those topics that's extremely politically incorrect, but is relatively popular with a lot of libertarians and a lot of post-libertarians. And I've got more than a few subscribers who are pretty interested and/or adherents to this kind of thinking. And so I get asked about it every once in a while if I make any video that could touch on it at all. And this is prompted by a video I made about 3 months ago titled "Who Will Incinerate the Children?" Basically, a commenter said he really doesn't care about foreigners getting killed because they're not as close to him genetically, and so to him it's kind of similar to. He actually compared it to killing puppies, and that he's not in favor of it, just like he's not in favor of killing puppies, but it doesn't really raise his ire. Now, like to an extent, I agree with that. I don't get as like upset about someone I don't know who I've never met, who I'll never meet, getting aggressed against as I do somebody who's closer to me, just at a visceral emotional level. But ethically, I don't see it as any different. Um, and we proceeded to have a bit of an exchange about basically race realism, and I think I agree with many of like the scientific or genetic claims of race realism. But I don't think that those claims, even if they're true, even if they're more true than they actually are, really do much, have many implications when it comes to political ideology. I don't think it says very much, if anything, about the efficacy of states or political power or nationalism. And the reason I feel that way is because, well, I'll get to that. So here's what I do agree with. Like, I don't think that I think that every person is unique. And I don't mean that in some special mealy mouth, feel good way. I just think that everyone's genetic makeup is slightly different from everybody else's. And even even people who have identical genetic makeup, I don't even think that's true anymore. I think they're discovering that even identical twins have tiny differences that simply just weren't detectable before. Even if they weren't, they have experiential differences that matter. The nature nurture argument. Um, you know, Identical twins who grow up in the same womb are not going to occupy the same space, and as such, they are going to have a different perspective, literally, uh, during their entire lives. And so, then a number of things that you can infer from their genetic similarity is limited, which is not to say it's not profound either. I'm not saying I don't want to minimize and say, oh, genetic similarities are irrelevant or can't tell you anything. That's obviously not the case, but they can't tell you everything. And in terms of ethics, you can't go that far with it. If we're talking, I mean, but a lot of this is just going to flow from the fact that I'm not in egalitarianism. Kind of the counter philosophical idea that really, really resists differentiation between persons and indeed within groups of people is our notions of egalitarianism. And I'm not an egalitarian. Now, in a philosophical, ethical sense or a moral sense, yes, sure, I am. Uh, but in terms of physical traits and what's important as far as most people are, when they talk about it, in terms of mental traits, I'm not an egalitarian. Right? I don't believe that any two people are identical or the same. And if you want to say that there are different groups that have different averages, that's fine too. I don't think that that's really even controversial. I don't think that there's debate about the scope and the specifics, but that there are differences. Sure, I don't think there's a debate, and I don't think that there's any reason to have a debate. I mean, the idea that we should all be clones of each other or identical, I don't see that as ethically really appealing or interesting. It's also blatantly false. Uh, you know, and and so in that way, I definitely fall into the race realist camp. I don't think it's wrong to talk about. I don't think it's wrong to study. I don't think it's wrong to draw some conclusions from that because there certainly are conclusions that are valid that can be drawn from genetic differences between people, including genetic differences in their ability to think. Um, so there's that. But what I don't like about race realism, especially when it comes to nationalism, well, there's two things I like. One, saying all that and saying that there are differences in averages and mean IQs and stature and certain other traits, maybe regarding violence or time preference or whatever else, um, for groups, that doesn't really answer the argument of methodological individualism. Uh, you can say that Group A has a standard IQ that is 10 points or 20 points lower than Group B, but that doesn't mean every member of each group. There's actually a huge amount of overlap, and although I don't think it's wrong to have stereotypes and to kind of use them as a benchmark when you don't know any better. For instance, if there's a certain group that is statistically more likely to be criminal, I don't think it's wrong for you to, in your daily life, incorporate that information when you're interacting with perfect strangers. It makes sense to assume that a young person or a black person in certain situations might be more likely to be aggressive against you uh, than just a random white person or a Chinese person or a Jewish person. Um, but that's only if you don't know any other information. If you learn, oh, they actually have a degree, or they're actually fairly intelligent, or they're hardworking, or whatever, which plenty of them are. It doesn't make sense to keep treating somebody based on an aggregate that doesn't actually apply to them. A black person whose IQ is 130 is a smart person, even if the average black person's IQ is 80 or whatever. It's totally retarded for me to think that you should look at an individual like that and treat them according to the aggregation of the group so defined. And of course, there's actually problems in defining the groups, I think. And the counterexample is also true. You're not going to treat a white person with dignity and respect and assume that he's good with money and that he's trustworthy and would never hurt you because he's white, because statistically he's less likely to be violent, because you could be wrong. That would be extremely foolish. And I've met plenty of white people who have extremely high time preference, who can't handle money, who can't be held responsible for anything. And on the other hand, I've met extremely competent, highly intelligent blacks. Um, so, you know, is a rubric when you're dealing with strangers. I don't think it's a bad thing to take it to the next level where you assume, regardless of counter evidence, that everyone you meet is part of this group of averages. I think that's extremely foolish and um, taking statistics a little bit too far. Um, but then the other problem I have when it comes to nationalism and statism, well, there's two other problems. One of the problems, if we're talking about somebody who is advocating government based on pointing out differences in genetics, um, their argument is assuming then the government, regardless of who's composing it, is a valid institution or a good institution or a utilitarian institution. I don't think any of those are true, and I don't think they're made more or less true based on the dynamics of the genetic dynamics of the population that the state's going to be established over. Like, if you have a population of less intelligent, high time preference people, the state's not going to do them any good. Um, if you have a population of more high functioning, more intelligent people, the state's not going to do them any good, and they wouldn't need one anyway. Even assuming like the argument, because a lot of the arguments for states are paternalistic, and you're saying, oh, this population, is pretty independent and able to handle things themselves. What's the argument? I don't see. It's just kind of, oh, there are differences, hence states. If that's the argument being leveled, which is not always the case, so I'm not going to say all race realists make this argument or are using it for that way. I just think when it is used, it's very insufficient. You have to come up with arguments why a state would be good in the first place. And you can't just say, well, genetic differences between Group A and Group B, hence a state. It doesn't logically follow. But then the other problem, and this is what I brought up in the comments, is that if we're talking about nationalism and ethics, I think that it's really, really arbitrary. Now, I use this term, and I was told, no, it's not arbitrary. You are objectively. He spoke to me like you are objectively more closely related to other white people or Western Europeans than you are to say South Asians or Africans or Australian Aborigines, and so you should care, and because you have selfish genes and you want to propagate your own genes, you should care more about people who are more related to you than people who are far related to you, or far more distantly related to you. And I would say that that is arbitrary because the line at which you should care is there's no reason. Like I have a sibling. I have one younger brother, so he's probably the most genetically related person to me in the world. And I have, I don't know, a dozen or so, maybe 20 cousins. I'm not about a dozen cousins, and maybe 20 other if you talk about aunts and uncles, and then maybe the children of cousins that are fairly closely related to me. And then once you start getting farther beyond that to second, third cousins, these are people who don't actually share a great deal of my genetic material. There's similar to me as a perfect stranger, and it's not clear at what line I should give a damn. Like, it's not enough to say that I should care about all white people by pointing out and saying that I'm more related to them than I am to some pygmy in sub-Saharan Africa. Just because they are closer genetically doesn't mean that I am bound to them certainly in a nationalistic sense. If we're talking about the propagation of my genes, nationalism loses all relevance beyond your immediate kin group. Um, it would be insane for me to dedicate and allocate the resources that I produce and create and bring into myself to further my genetic structure, which would be my siblings, my children, where I had to have any, and those of my cousins and maybe my second cousins. It would be insane from a genetic point of view to take my resources and squander them for the interests of people who are so much more distantly related to me, even if they are more related to me than people even farther removed. The idea that I should die in a trench with a Frenchman for my genetic, for the propagation of my genes is insane. I would do better for the propagation of my genes to let the Frenchman kill the German on his own, and I can stay at home and feed my children. Like the idea, and if now I'm not saying that specifically race realists are advocating exactly that, but that's the implication. I mean, if you're going to say it justifies nationalism, then that's what you're saying. That like, if the government tells you to go fight and die in a war, or to take your resources for whatever purpose, that's justified because that government is more related to you than some other government someplace else. And that just doesn't make sense. It's completely arbitrary. Like I could say, well, all of Eurasians, Chinese people, Japanese people, Korean people, they're more closely related to me than are, say, the Hazda Bush people in Tanzania. That doesn't mean that we should then form a state of all Eurasians / North South Americans. The line should the line be drawn there? Should the line be drawn at the Urals? Should it be drawn at the Danube or at the Rhine or at the Elbe? Should it be drawn at the English Channel? Should it be drawn? Like that's where it becomes arbitrary. That's where it becomes just. I've decided that at this line. I mean, this is what they are essentially doing. They're saying up to this point, you should care dearly and be willing to sacrifice your actual genetic well-being of yourself and your peers for this group, but not the other group. I just think that that's totally arbitrary and unjustifiable. I mean, it's not enough to say, well, there's a relative closeness or distance genetically, hence there's an obligation or duty, or it even makes sense. And of course, and this is all assuming that there's like ethical implications. Like just because you have a genetic affinity doesn't mean there's an ethical corollary with that, which is kind of just assumed, and I don't see why that should be. Um, I think that the very collectivistic kind of argument this is making is actually counterproductive. It's kind of interesting because if this is coming from a white person anyway, and I've said this before, like Western Europeans, and this isn't total, so I'm not saying this is 100%, but have kind of developed this idea where they kind of view everybody as a person, and they don't have there's the in group that's a very small kin group, tribe, or whatever, and then everyone else is subhuman to some extent, which is what throughout history most kind of groups have been like. Whenever people learn about some tribe in South America or Africa or Native American group, a lot of times they're like, oh, they're surprised to learn that that group considers itself to be true people and everyone else to be subhuman to some degree or another. And people are surprised to learn that, except it's incredibly common. I mean, when people learn that within Jewish ideology, that's very, very common. They're like, oh, the Jews, they're so racist, blah blah blah. But like everybody is like that. But then Western Europeans got way beyond that to seeing, oh, maybe everyone, maybe the rights of man, blah blah blah. I'm not saying it's 100%, but much further than others. And a lot of these people who believe in political implications to race realism point to that kind of outstanding feature of Western society, and rather than embrace and go, oh, this is a great strength, this is something that this is a difference between Western Europeans and other people that's given them a huge advantage, they look at it as a flaw, and then they want to emulate the actual more primitive cultures that they otherwise derive. So they would look at, because we can find societies that are like that. We can find societies that are more collectivistic and much more, if you're in my group, for you, and if you're outside my group, I don't trust you, I don't want to deal with you. And they live in mud brick, houses with thatched roofs, and there's more egalitarianism, uh, but they're also defined by poverty and stasis. Um, I haven't researched this a lot, but it has been researched. I bought a couple of books I'm just referenced in the last video. Tom Woods Tom Woods and Michael Huemer did two really great interviews. They didn't talk about this, but they referenced it. In very communal, family-based kin group societies, it's very hard to accumulate capital to develop economically, because as soon as any one member of the group comes in any wealth, the expectation is that he then has to disperse that among his group, which means capital accumulation never really happens. And the race realists out there probably look at that and say, oh, that's great. Look, he's not being a selfish individual. He's helping his genetically related people, and they're doing that to the exclusion of people outside the group. They're not distributing that to tribes people across the valley or Europeans or somebody else. They're keeping it within their genes. They're much less individualistic, and so, wow, aren't these groups like amazing? Like no, like they're backwards, and they ultimately have lost out, at least for now. And as long as they continue in that process, they're continuing to lose out. Like the ability to cooperate with the greater your capacity to cooperate with other people, despite there being genetic differences, you have a distinct advantage, maybe a decisive advantage. And it's not the only one. Obviously, intelligence. But there are other things. You know, Jared Diamond, I think, exaggerated and got a lot of things wrong, but he wasn't totally wrong. But when I look at it, if there is somebody who's genetically completely different from me, but I can cooperate for him in a mutually beneficial way that will help provide me and, by extension, my relatives with additional resources, then he's more important to me in terms of my genetic propagation than somebody who is more similar but doesn't do anything for me. And I think that logic is pretty simple. That genetic logic is pretty simple. I mean, the materialistic logic is simple too. And the idea that, well, I should disassociate with, or I shouldn't cooperate with this person, or it should be considered less favorable because he's so different from me, doesn't really ring true or make any sense. And the fact that you can do business with more people, it's good. I mean, it opens up huge opportunities that are not going to be there if you're going to be so insular in your horizons. And the result is that all my relatives, they live all over the country. We all live in like one big house or one town or even one state, and every node of my genetics that are out there are independent. They are self-supporting. They don't need like the backup of the rest of the family. It's there if they want it, like to a point, but only to a point. And it's not unconditional once you get past a certain age. And people, oh God, you're just, I don't know why people react so viscerally against it. It means that the genes are spread everywhere. Like they're not isolated geographically, and it makes them almost impossible to be extinguished because it would be, I mean, a meteorite could strike and it would likely not kill my entire extended family. Like, and I'm not speaking of just me personally, but like any group that's like that. You know, the radical, and it is like Westerners and especially Americans more than other Westerners, are hyper individualistic relative to the rest of societies. And you know, it's very strange when somebody who wants to laud the superiority of the white Anglo-Saxon American, and then they like that superiority, but then they look at one of the major traits, which is probably contributing factor. I won't say it's the only factor, but a contributing factor to that. It's certainly not hurting. It's very hard for me to see how this is hurting. And people are going to point out, oh, look at these videos of race riots of like these other races or whatever in LA or in Europe or whatever. Like, how is that? Is that really hurting the genetic spread of Europeans? Like, I don't see it. Like, so yeah, I don't think that there are really strong political implications. None of this addresses the efficacy of states. That's just taken for granted. The idea that I should expect, like, maybe I do favor, like, two sides are fighting a war in Eurasia, and one of them is genetically more similar to me than the other. And so maybe I think, okay, all things being equal, I prefer the propagation of those genes to my own, or to those less. Okay, that's fine. How much do I care? How much of an investment do I have in the outcome of that conflict? Maybe you raise one finger, like the calories to do that, to click like on a Facebook thing. Like, it makes no sense for the continuation of my genes to expend any more resources than that for that endeavor. In fact, it would be counterproductive. Like, and if we're talking about favoring governments and supporting their wars and everything, which is what some of these people are advocating, like, it's completely retarded in terms of propagating my own genes. To sacrifice what's closest to you, the stuff that actually genetically matters by far the most, in the name of more general ideology, genetic affinity, much more general, on the justification, well, there are still people even farther removed than them, so you should support them. It just does not make any sense, and it's completely arbitrary. Should it be just me? Should it be just my sibling? Should it be my cousins, my second cousins? I mean, what's the line? Because it drops off precipitously in terms of the validity of expanding my own genes. Like, am I going to hurt my own reproductive abilities by allocating my resources to some random stranger who has more genetic affinity to me than a different random stranger who is from Africa? That doesn't make any sense to me. There's a huge leap in the logic there. It's funny how you can pride yourself on being free thinking, and it's true. Like, kudos to people who are not constrained by political correctness. Political correctness is evil. It's stupid. It's retarded. It should be abolished. I have a high tolerance for people, even if they're wrong, if they're fine in the face of political correctness. That said, it's not enough, to say that you're right, just to be contrarian. And it's also, I mean, you're bringing in all these other ethical considerations, political considerations that aren't warranted even by, the genetic facts on the ground. And yeah, I mean, that's the way I look at it. I will always be a methodological individualist. That doesn't mean stereotypes are bad or invalid. That doesn't mean, you use what information you have in your life. If you know that this or that group, I mean, then you know that, okay, there's a higher probability. But if once you're presented with more specific information, you should judge accordingly. I'm not going to cozy up with a violent, irresponsible white person because on average white people are not violent and irresponsible. And I'm not going to, turn away the opportunity to do profitable business with a black person because on average many black people, maybe aren't that intelligent or good with money, because there's enough that are, that it's just retarded. And people have asked me kind of like, well, given the fact that there's these differences in a libertarian society like a DROs, are they going to, how isn't that going to have a big effect? And so, Well, it will have an effect certainly, but I don't think it's as, you know, in a capitalist moneyed economy with a division of labor, um, you're gonna you're gonna have things that are going to be based on homo economicus, which is not true. Like, I know people are not homo economicus, but when they interact with each other in the market, that's how they're seen. So like, yes, there are groups that maybe have lower time preference, are more prone to crime and violence, and have less income. That doesn't mean that there's going to be insurance companies that only cater to blacks. Then it means that there's probably going to be insurance companies that cater to low-income, high-risk people, and maybe many of their customers will be black and many of their customers will be white. But you're going to have other companies that charge lower rates for more stable, more investable people. And if there's any blacks, and certainly there are, who are fiscally responsible enough, hardworking enough, um, have a low enough time preference, those companies have every incentive to do business with them. And they're not going to turn them away because, on average, like that group has certain characteristics. At least I think that's highly unlikely. Um, and also the logic is, well, once you have, I mean, I've heard this said. It seems really silly to me. Like, well, what if one group is so like, but so barbaric, so different, that none of its members are capable. Well, then what that would probably mean is that they wouldn't be running the business. You probably have something like what we have right now, which is you have service industries that are catering to these people, and the businesses aren't actually owned by those people. They probably be owned by Jews, to be perfectly frank, because that's the way it is right now. Because Jews seem to be pretty good at running businesses and handling money and all. Like, people are gonna hate me for this, but like, it's not a diss, it's a compliment. Like, I know I'm probably gonna catch hell for that one, but it's just like, what's the big deal? Like, who cares? Like, no one's gonna turn away money because they want to perpetuate, um, cultural or statistical averages, and yeah. So that's pretty much it. This is gonna be a relatively short video, at 27 minutes, I guess, but um, definitely there are differences between every person. There's differences between groups, although how you define the groups is on the margins, especially, is really kind of tricky. The ethical implications of this, I think, are pretty mild. I mean, we could say that there's a spectrum of humanity, and this is a debate that doesn't just talk about race, but it talks about children and fetuses and abortion and comatose people and retarded people and all that. Like, I am receptive to the idea that there is a range, and that maybe certain groups have less rights in some sense. I'm receptive to that idea. I'm not endorsing it. And I have reasons for being very skeptical about. I don't want to categorize someone who has rights as someone who doesn't have rights. I want to err on the side of not committing rights violations. And so that's why I'm so hard up against, say, abortion or circumcision or the rights of children. And the thing is, children, fetuses, like comatose people or whatever, they're in a kind of a gray area. Someone whose IQ is 85 is not in the gray area, or even 70. Somebody who has a high time preference is not in the gray area. That area is well within uh, the common ethical haze. I don't see very strong reasons, very, very weak reasons, for making major ethical exceptions, or parallel systems when you're talking about things that actually aren't that. And I'm not saying it's an insignificant difference, but compared to, the actual range of humanity, it actually is pretty insignificant, at least as far as I'm concerned. And maybe that's arbitrary. Someone's going to come up and say, "Oh, you're being arbitrary." I'm erring on the side of not cutting things too close. Uh, I think there's good ethical reasons for viewing it that way. Um, it's a demonstrated fact that you can um, prosperously cooperate with these people. I know people are going to say, "Oh no, you can't," just and that lists all these problems, and like, that's so. It's just like not counting all the bad things states do. It's, if you look at race relations, and you only count the bad things, and you miss the fact of all the times that there were mutually beneficial interactions, which dwarf by many orders of magnitude the not mutually beneficial interactions, and you're going to come up with faulty conclusions. And I think that's what we have a lot of going on here. So anyway, I will talk to you all later. I'll have more videos to come. I think my next one will probably be about Israel and Zionism. I think I need to do 2 more about that. It will be a review of Shlomo Sand's book, The Creation of the Nation of Israel, or the People of Israel. Creation of the People of Israel, I think. It's been a couple months since I read it now, but I definitely want to do that video. And then I actually want to do one specifically about questions of justice and land allocation within the Zionist state today. I just real briefly, I think people try and oversimplify that to either all the Jews have to go or all the Palestinians have to go, and unfortunately, not unfortunately, it's good, but like frustratingly, it's not that simple. And I'd like to talk about that. I have more Israeli subscribers than I thought, or people who live in Israel. One of them, I forget your name. Sorry, an American who lives in Israel, and then I have other Israelis. And yeah, I definitely want to talk about it. But anyway, peace.